Greetings, everyone. I had to make some repairs to my 1032 Bale Wagon, and didn't see a lot of information out there, so I thought I'd just do a quick little video as I went through the process, just to let everyone else see what I did. The old shaft you can see here taken apart. I had to cut it out in several pieces. The sprockets had been welded on, and bearings were rusted and in pretty tough shape. So on the one end where the U-joint goes for the PTO shaft, it kind of has an odd shape there. But I'll show you how I machined that off. And again, this was a collar that was on there. I think it was a positioning collar to stop the shaft from sliding around. I had to heat it to get it off, and then heat it to get it back on. It cooled down and held itself in place. There you could have seen the weld where this big sprocket was welded on. It was the main reason I replaced this whole drive shaft. Here in a second you'll see a video of it. That's the end of the shaft. It had the bearing on it, and then it has a small sprocket on the end which drives the pickup chain. The small sprocket was actually on with set screws and a keyway, but the end of the shaft was mushroomed on it also, so it wouldn't come off. I added a feature to the shaft I'll show you here in a minute, but you can see the sprocket was pretty well shot. So anyway, I went to the local bearing shop, found sprockets and bearings to replace it. Now that small bearing, or small sprocket rather, the bore diameter is a little too small, and there wasn't enough material to bore it out, and so I ended up turning the end of the shaft down, which you'll see here in a minute, to fit that sprocket on. So this is a test piece. I just wanted to make sure I wouldn't have any problem making the shapes and making all the cuts. I actually did all the machining on this little short piece of shaft just to test my abilities there. Everything seemed to work quite well, so you'll see those videos here in a second. This was the 1/4 inch keyway pocket for the big sprocket, as you can see there. And then on the end of the shaft for that smaller sprocket, it's a 3/16 keyway. I ended up drilling and tapping the end of this shaft and putting another heavy washer on the end of it that I made just so that I didn't have to mushroom the end of the shaft like the other one was. Hopefully it'll hold on okay. This is just starting to turn on the main shaft, the actual piece, so it's just turning that end down to fit the small sprocket. I'm not showing all the steps. I was only cutting maybe 20, 30 thousandths at a pass here, and then the final pass I went 5 thousandths just for a clean pass, but it cut pretty well. Some of you might ask what lube I use there. It's just a cutting fluid used for tapping and drilling, and I just use that when I'm cutting steel or harder materials on the lathe. You can see the sprocket fits really well. Nice tight fit. Just try it. So here's the added feature I was telling you about. I'm just drilling and tapping the end of this shaft so I can put basically a cap on the end of it to hold that small sprocket in place. Even though it has set screw and keyway, I don't think it would come off, but since the old shaft had been hammered on pretty hard to mushroom the end to, I'm assuming, to hold the little sprocket on, I thought I'd put a cap on it instead. It was kind of a pain to get that thing out of there. Like I said, I had to cut the shaft in about 3 or 4 pieces to get it off. So I'm hoping that if I ever have to replace it again, I'll be able to just disassemble it. This is just the way I chose to tap it. I used a regular tap handle with the little hole in the end and guide it with the tailstock there. I prefer using these type of tap handles on a smaller taps. This is a 1/4 tap. I know you could always put the tap in your drill chuck and then just turn your 3-jaw chuck by hand, but I feel that I have better feedback on the tap to my hand when I'm using this little hand tap. I can tell whether or not it's getting too tight and I don't want to break the tap off in there. Here I'm milling the 3/16 keyway on the end of that shaft for that little sprocket. Yeah, I know the shaft's hanging out past the end of the vise, but it's a short distance and I'm taking light cuts, so I'm not too stressed about it moving. And it cut just fine. I do have a little bit of an issue with this spindle on this mill. If anybody happens to know how to help me out, I'd appreciate it. The spindle itself appears to have become magnetized at some point, and so it's all the shavings whenever I'm milling steel stick to it, stick to the end mill, stick to the spindle, and I have to constantly blow it off. I've taken an electric coil and tried to demagnetize the end of the spindle, but I'm afraid I might have to pull the spindle clear out to do that. So if you have any tricks for that, let me know. Anyway, this is just fitting the sprocket on the end. Really good and snug fit on there. Here we're cutting the other end of the shaft, and this is for that odd shaped for the U-joint attachment, or the yoke, U-joint yoke. And I just had to take 100 thousandths off each side perpendicular. Well, I guess it would be, well, the two sides are parallel with each other, but on the opposite sides of the shaft. So I positioned it here and decided to do a side cut rather than an end cut, and that way I didn't have to shift the shaft at all in position. I just switched over to the other side. Sorry about the video here. The camera must have slipped down and I missed milling that side. But anyway, it milled down just fine, and here's the test fit of that yoke. Good and snug. I still have to drill a hole through the end of that. It has a pin that goes through there, but I didn't video that portion. So this is cutting the 1/4 inch keyway for the big sprocket. I took light passes until you get into the pocket, just so the end mill wouldn't move around on me. But I was cutting maybe 20 thousandths. I think about 20 thousandths per pass, or maybe 25 at the most, taking it nice and easy. But you can see how all the swarf there magnetized. It's frustrating. Anyway, this is a collar. Had to heat it up, slip it on the shaft, put it where it needed to be, and let it cool down. And then the sprocket, of course, on this end. I waited until I got it into the Bale Wagon to get everything positioned just right. I got the bearing there sliding, so I can position, get the sprockets lined up with the chains. Here you can see where I drilled the end of that shaft, put a 1/4 20 bolt in it, holding this little washer. I didn't video making that. All it was a piece of the 1-inch shaft cut off and drilled out and faced off on both sides. So that's pretty much it, I think. Here's video showing it temporarily set in there to get everything lined up and positioned where it needs to be. Of course, I measured that collar before I let it cool down and lock on the shaft. But all the sprockets are lined up good. On the inside here, you can see the inner bearing and then the little sprocket down to that other. You can see I put new bearings on that lower shaft too. I tore that all apart and redid it. It was in pretty tough shape too. One of the bearings was actually seized. That's about it. Here's the completed. Put a little bit of anti-rust coating on it there just to help out a little bit, and everything seems to look good. Well, thanks for watching.